Hey, good morning, good evening, good afternoon, and good night. My name is Lee, and you are joining us, the Cloudways Mavericks, and Joe Dolson, as we talk great UX and business growth with accessible websites. Don't go anywhere because you are going to learn some incredible things about accessibility that you will wish you knew last year. Trust me. Joe, no pressure, mate. I just thought I'd put that in and really set the bar high.
That's great. I love knowing in advance that I really need to perform.
That's awesome. So, folks, we would love for you to stay tuned throughout this as you are watching. Please let us know in the comments, whether you're watching on Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, etc. What are your biggest takeaways? What didn't you know? If you also have some tips and tricks that you'd love to share with us, maybe something new in WordPress that you found, etc., then please, again, do share those in the comments. We are a community and we would love to hear from you. Before we do, let's do a very quick round robin just to introduce each one of us, and then Peacher is going to set the scene. So, Jan, can you give us a quick 30-second hello?
Of course. My name is Jan. I'm the owner of Visual Summit Mastery, and I help people run visual events to establish their brands and grow their businesses. Way faster than 30 seconds, Lee.
I know. I'm Lee. I'm the host of the Agency Trailblazer podcast. You can find that at agencytrailblazer.com. Joe, how about yourself?
I'm Joe Dolson. I'm an accessibility consultant and a WordPress core committer. And nice. I'm here to talk about WordPress accessibility.
Sweet. And Peacher, I'll hand over to you for your intro and the let's get cracking.
Hi, I am Peacher Neri. I am a UX and design expert. I'm also a maverick at Cloudways, just like you two. Yeah, my beloved maverick colleagues. So, Joe, I'm so glad that you're here because we are doing this series on accessibility because I feel it's extremely important, and I would love to do my tiny little bit to get accessibility to go mainstream. I keep learning. I'm not an expert, although I think I maybe know a little bit by now, but we're calling experts such as you to teach us about it. Now, before we get started with the actual questions, I wanted to find out from you, because you're a web developer to start with, and then you got into accessibility around 2004. So what I'd like to know is, I mean, in 2004, it wasn't sexy, was it? It was not like, not everybody was talking about accessibility. It was still like GeoCities and, and blinking stuff all over the place. So what got you into accessibility from web development, or as well as web development?
So actually, I got into web accessibility almost at the same time as I got into web development. And this is because it actually comes out of my family. My mother was the executive director of a nonprofit arts organization in Montana that specifically focused on providing arts access for people with disabilities. And so, I grew up in this environment and I was aware of the issues surrounding people with disabilities. And so in 2004, when I was first deciding, I think I'm tired of working for other people and want to kind of go out on my own. And I think web development seems like a great place to start pushing myself as a business. I didn't really want to just go into marketing. I didn't really like everything I was seeing in the websites out there, but I knew I had this other knowledge set in accessibility. And so I started to learn about what it meant to be accessible on the web, and found that that was a really severely underserved need at the time. And so that was kind of my entryway into web development. I'd already been doing some development for a few years prior to that. It's not that I decided to suddenly throw my slate out and become a business having never, ever touched a website before, though it was really close. But accessibility was a unique selling point that I could have as part of my services. So it's been something I've done from the very, very beginning. I used to tell people, and this is a statement that probably reflects how old I am and doesn't mean anything to current developers, that I had never built a website that used tables for layout, which is still true because I haven't changed that. But now nobody builds sites with tables for layout, so it doesn't really carry the same weight it used to.
I could only ever build websites with tables because that was the only concept I could grasp very early on with HTML4 was tables and tables within tables, and I got Colspan and everything else. And when people were saying no, you should use CSS and that, and I was trying to float things, I would get so stressed out I'd end up going back to tables again. That's my little confession of the day.
Oh well, man, floating anything in Internet Explorer 5 was just such a nightmare. What is going to happen? I don't know.
I remember.
Wow. Well, but even as a designer who then, when I turned to the web, I started learning HTML and things like that, just to understand what it was all about. I remember coming across various courses that still advocated the use of tables. And I'm talking about maybe 2012 when I started learning this stuff, which is, anyway, a fascinating story because it's unusual to find someone that gets into both things at the same time. And now, in a while, I really want to touch upon the fact that you are very well known in the WordPress community as a WordPress core committer and as a WordPress accessibility expert. So accessibility in general, but also accessibility as relative to WordPress, which I find extremely interesting, and we'll have plenty of time to touch on that. Now, one question that I want to kick off the whole thing with is, I think, very relevant to small business owners and, small agencies and freelancers and so on, that now have to tackle the fact that you've got to be accessible. It shouldn't be new. It should always have been the case. But the reality of things is that up until not long ago, it wasn't a hot issue. Now it's kind of coming to the surface more and more. It's a little bit like what responsiveness was a few years ago. Now people are really understanding. So I like to really push the agenda of accessibility being very important for business, because I think there are two sides to it. First of all, there's the legal obligations, but rather than just scaring people with those, I think there's lots of opportunities for growth as well, thanks to accessibility. Would you agree?
Oh, absolutely.
Both things.
Yes. There's no question. The legal obligation is pretty straightforward and is pretty well established in law. The tricky part about that, of course, is that while the obligation is well established, the guidelines of what it actually means for your site to be accessible in the law, not so well established. And we owe that to Donald Trump when he canceled the development of internet regulations surrounding accessible websites in, I think that was 2017, which were already way behind schedule and should have been out there many years earlier. So it's not solely his fault, but they were on their way until that point. And that the lack of regulations just makes everything unclear. It just means that a business owner can't go to the law and say, what do I need to do to make my website accessible? Now, from a practical standpoint, what you need to do is really try and conform to the same website guidelines for accessibility that anybody tries to conform to. And that's mostly the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, usually referred to as WCAG, at level 2.0, or if you're working a little harder, 2.1, to level AA. And that's a pretty good, solid level of accessibility. The AAA level of accessibility is where you're going to start to encounter some really complex characteristics about websites. So it's reasonable to say that we're only really going to tackle level AAA if we are specifically focused on that type of content, or specifically focused on an audience that needs that, because it's a lot of work. And it's very complex, and some things are only semi-solved problems. Some of the things surrounding having audio description for video are legitimately difficult. So a business really needs to consider that to be their legal obligation, even though the reality of the law is basically vague. But as far as it goes, what it's going to do for your business, which make your business more successful, there's simply no question that having an accessible website gives you a reach that you absolutely do not have otherwise. There's a percentage of the audience, which is not insubstantial, that is completely unavailable to you if you're not embracing web accessibility. And people sometimes make the argument that, well, why do I need to make my website accessible? My customers don't have disabilities. And it's like, well, you've got that backwards. Your customers don't have disabilities because they can't use your website. So they're not your customers if they have a disability.
That's a great.
It's not because they don't want to use your business.
Is that also a selling point for some customers? Like, I am a web developer focused on accessibility while my competition is not?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes.
It's if you want to put it from a sort of mercenary point of view, it's a product. It's an extra product that you can sell. And I think, Joe, that it's quite easy to find figures that prove that the accessible market is really big. That the number of people that would use your services but don't is quite high. I think there's a really big market out there, isn't there?
Well, there are numbers for characteristics such as the number of people in the world who have some form of disability, and that is actually quite high. It's well over 1 billion people. It does have to be considered a little bit in context that for the most part, wheelchair users are not heavily impacted by website accessibility issues. So there are whole populations of people with disabilities for whom the accessibility of your website is not directly impacting them. It's still relevant because even if your website is fully accessible, but it doesn't say anything about whether, for example, your theater has ramped access, then that it becomes a barrier to users with wheelchairs. It may be that they can use your website perfectly fine, even though your website isn't very accessible to people using screen readers. But if they can't get to your show, it doesn't really matter.
Yeah, and there's also, that's a really good point, actually. But there's also the consideration of temporary disabilities, of course. You may not identify as disabled, and yet you may have a temporary disability which can express itself in a number of ways. We've been saying this in other episodes of this series, but I think it's really worth banging on about it so that people just get it, because we all are at some point temporarily disabled, apart from the fact that we should design for our future selves. So if we can see now, maybe we won't in 20 years' time, for instance.
Absolutely. I mean, if anybody who's ever broken their mouse-using wrist, it will very quickly discover that not being able to use a mouse is a pretty serious detriment to using a lot of websites. Not to mention the fact that you then have to actually learn how you go about using your computer.
The battery just needs to die on this, and then I'm screwed.
Absolutely.
I don't know any keyboard shortcuts.
Yep. And I'm pretty confident in some article at some point I cited having your battery die as a problem.
Yeah.
I think it was because my mouse battery had just died.
No way.
So, yeah, because there's the usual thing that we can't identify with someone until it happens to us, which, we could do better. In fact, I think that personally for the things that I build, the keyboard test is the one that maybe I lack. I'm a bit afraid of. I need to get better at that. But yes, so definitely both legal obligations and opportunities for growth as an agency if you offer your services in the services of accessibility.
Now, one thing in that whole, offering accessibility services as kind of an add-on is not actually something I particularly encourage. I really think any developer should be incorporating some level of accessibility as just their default way of doing their job. Because that's really just doing your job right. You know, any architect who's licensed, at least in the United States, if you design a building that isn't accessible, it's just not going to be permitted. Assuming that the people handling the permitting process and giving permissions for this building to be built are doing their job right, which doesn't happen 100% of the time, that building just won't happen because you're not doing it professionally. There's an expectation and you need to do that. And I think people in web development should be doing the same thing. And this is a problem with the fact that there isn't a lot of formal training for web development, and there are an awful lot of courses and classwork in web development that simply doesn't cover accessibility.
Yeah, that's actually a great segue to my next question. I would love to hear your thoughts. WordPress is incorporating accessibility coding standards in core as well with the AA level. What about all those developers, plugin developers, theme developers, and so on? Do you find that they pay attention to those standards, or could they use some education as well?
They could certainly use some education. Some plugin and theme developers are very conscientious about paying attention to the kinds of standards that WordPress is trying to get everybody to follow in what they write for WordPress. I don't want to just say, no, there are no plugin and theme developers doing a good job. That's not true. But there's no question that there's a healthy selection of projects out there that are popular and widely used that are simply not accessible, that are really fairly disastrous from an accessibility standpoint. And sometimes and I am a plugin developer. I've developed several plugins myself. And I do know that one hard problem as a plugin developer is backwards compatibility. And once you've made some kind of mistake in the front end of your plugin, it's very difficult to change it because now suddenly there may be thousands of websites depending on that code. And that can be very frustrating. So I don't want to give the impression that it's a simple problem and that these plugin developers should just pull themselves together and fix it, because fixing it might create other problems as well. But in new development, in the admin, planning routes to improve the front end of their plugins if they're actually not meeting standards, I'd love to see more of that.
Do you have some resources where you could point developers to educate themselves about accessible code?
I mean, there are a lot of resources. I would start at a website called webaim.org. And that's web accessibility in mind is what the phrase actually stands for. And that's a nonprofit organization out of one of the universities in Utah that escapes my mind right now. And they just publish an enormous amount of documentation on what it means to be accessible. And it's written at a very easy to understand level. Ultimately, obviously, the official requirements are kind of the defining characteristic of what is accessible and what isn't, but they are also very difficult to read and understand. WebAIM provides documentation that's much easier. But also, you know, the Mozilla Developer Network has really great documentation. It covers things in a very effective way, and they almost always try and take accessibility into consideration in the way they document any feature. And that is a huge thing in any tutorial or class, is the fact that when you describe anything you're trying to do, you should try and consider the accessibility of how it should be used. A common problem in demo versions of things is that they've been simplified. You know, you strip out everything that isn't directly relevant to the problem you're trying to teach. And I've seen a ton of demos where among the things they've stripped out is like they've stripped out the for ID relationship between a label and an input form. Because, you know, it's visual clutter. It's just going to make this complicated. But developers cut and paste. And so those problems propagate infinitely. They just get repeated over and over and over again. And so you end up with a ton of, frankly, terrible software because it's just replicated these problems.
The copy and paste, I'm afraid I am completely guilty of. I think, how do I do X, Y, and Z? Somebody shows me a great example. I copy and paste that. I don't consider anything else beyond that. One of the things you mentioned during that, Joe, was WordPress trying to direct and support people building better, more accessible code and a more accessible environment. With WordPress 5.8 coming around the corner, are you aware of what we can expect?
So a big focus in WordPress 5.8 has been some tweaks to the media library, and of course the continuing work on the full site editing suite that Gutenberg is being extended to. I think the major part of that that's releasing in 5.8 is the new block editor for widgets. And in that area, there's a lot of inherited accessibility, because one of the things about the way Gutenberg works is that mostly the changes you make in one area are being propagated outside. And I don't work on Gutenberg directly very much myself. I do know that there have been some problems in some of those widgets in that they changed some of the output code, which is gradually being fixed. But I'm not 100% up to date on that. What I did work on a lot this particular round was the media library. And one change that's coming that is probably going to be a little controversial is the elimination of infinite scroll in the media library.
Oh, thank the Lord.
And that's a thing. If you don't know what infinite scroll is, which obviously Lee does, that's a thing where you just scroll your mouse and it just loads more and more and more images until you finally get to the one you want. And now it's been switched to a load more button.
Oh, well, that's better than the thing. I was thinking you were going to say about pagination.
I don't really like. Yeah, I don't really like load more either, but it's better than infinite scrolling, that's for sure.
Yeah, well, and I will say that the media library in WordPress is very hard to work with. I think the ultimate goal is we're hoping to try and maybe make it more paginated, but the first step is to start building something in that it isn't just continuous, and that was a surprisingly large amount of work. It actually took, wow. I think that's been in progress since WordPress 5.4.
That's ages. One thing I do is I switch to the list view, which allows me to paginate. So I just tend to default to list view nowadays. But that's really
the infinite scroll is also being propagated into the modal. So that's the way you actually access the media library whenever you're adding an image to a post or anything.
Yeah.
And it will be controversial because some people just they like the ease and simplicity of just scrolling with the mouse button. But from somebody who's dependent on a keyboard and a screen reader, infinite scroll is just deadly. It just keeps going and going. And now you're like, how do I get out of this?
I was just going to ask, because some people might not understand the rationale behind why infinite scroll isn't accessible, why that's a problem. So thank you so much for elaborating that.
And
one thing I wanted to ask you, we appreciate it. I wanted to ask you whether there's any chance at all that one day we'll have image folders.
It's certainly something that's been talked about. I think we would absolutely love to do it. But as I said, the code behind the media library is actually really hard to work with. It's a development problem. I'll tell you some background to the media library, which is that the person who wrote it left the project not long after it released. And so there were a few years where the only activity done on the media library was desperate bug fixes and documentation to try and figure out how the thing worked. Now there's a lot of people who know it reasonably well, but it's still extremely complicated. And so figuring out all of the dependencies and where everything has changed, it's going to be some work. And I don't know that we'll do folders.
Yeah.
I think it's more likely that we'll add something along the lines of a core use of taxonomies to group things.
Yeah.
It's more flexible than folders, and it also doesn't depend on actually sorting the images. It only depends on sorting the data, because every image has a database representation.
Yeah, I think that's what I meant, because I used to be a book designer and a catalog, exhibition catalog. I did a lot of those. So it was essential that before work started, we'd organize everything in a way that would make it easy to then put it all on the page. And if it had been the way the WordPress media library is, you would have it would have been so much harder to work with, which in fact, that's what happens with the media library. But I feel like we're digressing a little bit. So
Yeah, I think you're probably
Geeking out already.
Geeking out. I think the media library in WordPress is a something we could carry on talking about for a long time. But yeah, so but it's related though to my next question, which is about the concept of accessible content, and which I think is also really, really, really important, because there's many people who build things on the web, but they don't build them for other people. They're not web designers. They're more like content creators. And they seem to think that accessibility doesn't apply to them so much because they're not building websites for a living. But accessible content is very important, isn't it? And there's various aspects to it. How would you explain it so that people understand that it matters to them too?
Well, I would actually say that the accessible content is the essence of web accessibility. I mean, the document, which is the standards, the web content accessibility guidelines, the essence of that is that it's about getting access to the content. And for example, in the accessibility ready theme program that WordPress has for their theme directory, there's a reason that we don't ever say that a theme is WCAG compliant, and that's because themes don't have content. So it doesn't mean anything. You're not accessing any content, so how can you say that it's compliant to anything in particular? The content needs to be accessible because the content is where you have all of your images, and those images need to have alternative text so that people who can't see the image get information out of them. Your content has your videos, so the videos need to have your captions. The videos may need to be described. The videos need to make sure they don't trigger a
fit?
I'm epileptic seizure.
Epileptic.
I don't know, somehow I was stumbling on the word epileptic for a moment. There are so many problems, and so many of those come to content. There's just the way you write your content. If you say something along the lines of, to learn more about this problem, click here, and the word here is linked, that's a really ineffective link. Somebody with a screen reader who's just trying to scan through and find out what your content is about, just jumping from link to link, well, I don't know what here is. What am I going to get with that? So there's an enormous number of aspects of content and the way it's actually written that are crucial to making a website actually be accessible.
So it's interesting that you say that. Sorry, interesting that you say that, because I remember many times I've said, yes, we will make you an accessible website, and we do, but within, say, 6 months, they are now starting to fail, but that's because they're copying and pasting stuff in from Word. They're uploading images without anything. Even though we've provided them some initial training, they're still not doing that. But then the complaint came back on us, and I hadn't worded my contract well enough, so I was actually fixing the content that they had put in. I just remember that being a frustration, so we had to update our copy and say, everything we put in will be compliant as per these standards. And I can't remember the website we used, but it was AA compliant, I believe. Yeah. And then once we finished, it's then over to you to adhere to those standards, and here's the best documentation we can provide you, or go on a care plan and we'll put the content in for you, and we'll continue to apply those standards.
And that's a problem for everybody. Yeah. I have that problem too. And even though I'm working with clients who are frequently accessibility organizations, but that doesn't change the fact that they are non-professional web developers, and because a small nonprofit has a very limited budget, they're having themselves do this work, and I give training, I provide documentation, but that's not a guarantee because there's a lot of complexity to what may or may not happen. The block editor in WordPress tries to do some things to make that a little bit better, but it doesn't go anywhere near far enough. It doesn't. There's another guideline. It's called the Authoring Tool Accessibility Guidelines, or ATAG, and that's a document that is around what it takes for an authoring tool or a content management system like WordPress to be accessible, and that's about how it emphasizes and supports the creation of accessible content. And that's something that I would love to see WordPress move closer to. Right now, there are some minor things like it will notify you about invalid heading hierarchy, and it will notify you if you choose a color pairing in one of the blocks that is not does not meet color contrast standards. And those are both really useful, but the warnings aren't particularly prominent. They're very easy to miss. There's also a problem around that with, say, image alt attributes. How do you require an alt attribute? Some content management systems have implemented that those are required, and you have to enter one. And the way they've gotten around the fact that it is actually true that not every image needs to have content in the alt attribute is they usually have some kind of weird code you have to enter, like a double quote means that there's nothing. And that's really a hack, because that's not what it should be. And in fact, I don't know what those content management systems actually do on the front end, but if they include that double quote, and I have seen this appear on various sites, that will be read, because that means you've got an alt text, which is a double quote. That's text. It'll be read very strangely, but it will be read.
So what to do instead? Because if you have a background image and if you upload an image as a background from the WordPress media library, it does say, because I was doing it today, in the alt space says it says if this image is purely decorative, you don't need to enter alt text. So in that case, should I worry about it? I mean, it's not me inputting the codes, the quotes. So is that okay to just ignore it?
It is okay to just ignore it. Although in that particular case, because it's a background image, there is no alternative text. Background images are only applied by CSS, and so they actually would not be even present in the DOM, in the document object model, so that the accessibility API isn't going to articulate that to a screen reader. So
there you go. So designer who needs to learn more.
Well, what that really means is that if you're putting in a background image, you need to make sure that it is an image that doesn't contain content. I see a lot of background images that have text on them, like this is what we're using for our text is in this background image, and that just doesn't exist. It's just not on the website if that's what you're trying to do. You need some other text that actually reflects what that says. But yes, it's absolutely okay for an image to have empty alt text if the image isn't content. And you have ornamental graphics, you have just things just to add color. Those exist. It is a real thing.
Yeah.
Quick question,
the text on image, image thing is a particular bugbear of mine as a designer. Anyway, it makes no sense. So anyway, sorry, Jan. Carry on.
No worries, Peter. That was a good point. Joe, regarding images and videos and stuff like that, how does lazy loading impact accessibility?
It doesn't very much, because the images, as long as the image is loaded by the time somebody gets to it, it's generally fine. I know that there is an issue right now in WordPress that causes some problems with the first images on a plane, because it lazy loads all of the images, including any that are above the fold when you first load the page. And apparently that causes some problem. I'm not totally clear what it is. I didn't actually read the issue. I just saw the title. But I'm not aware of accessibility problems with lazy loading images. Because,
That's great to
I mean, the
hear.
code is actually loaded, so
Yeah.
the alt attribute should be there even if the image isn't yet.
Yeah, that's a good point. And what do you think about website overlays in terms of accessibility? How do you like those? I mean, you've had a blog post on your page. I saw that. So
Yes.
I'd love for you to dive into this.
So first of all, I do want to say that overlays actually encompass a pretty wide range of things that can be anywhere from extremely focused, custom-written overlays that are fixing a definite set of known problems to complete garbage that is just using machine learning to try and analyze your page and figure out what problems you might have. And so there's a spectrum there. But overall, they're not the solution. All an overlay can be, all it ever should be, is a temporary solution while you figure out how to fix the actual problem. Because even if, so I have a plugin, WP Accessibility, that does have some overlay characteristics. And one of the things, for example, that it does is that it will detect if you have a core WordPress form field, that means either the comment form or the search form, that doesn't have a label. And it will insert a label for that field. And the reason it's able to do that is because I know what the names of those fields are. They have to be the same name because otherwise they just won't work. And so I can find them and I can check whether or not there's a label. Nonetheless, that's not the right solution. It's just, I don't have the expertise to fix my theme, so I'm going to install this and it'll take care of that problem for me until I have somebody who can fix it. Ultimately, with all of these overlays, the real problem is still in the code, and you still need to fix the code. And there are some overlay vendors who will swear up and down that their product is the solution to your website accessibility problems, and you should just pay them your monthly fee and you won't have any problems. You'll be totally safe. Everything is great. And that is just a lie. It is just flat out a lie. That is not what's going to happen.
There was in the past few days, there was a big hoo-ha on Twitter about one of these big name providers. I won't name it necessarily, although it's all out there in Twitter. And
there's a kind of an illusion of us not naming these people.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, I don't think it's a problem with naming them, is it? We can? I don't know. Anyway.
I don't know. We've gone so far down the line of not naming them now. Why not? Why not just stick with it?
Let's not name them and keep going.
But the main problem, I think, with these things, as you were saying, Joe, is that people think that accessibility is a patch-on. It's not. Because another thing that I say all the time as a designer is that if you follow good design practices, you are already accessible. Like, you don't put text on an image anyway. You don't do things like that anyway, because it doesn't make sense from a good design standpoint. So it's all, I think, it all needs to start from being good at your job, really doing it well and doing it in the right way from the beginning, which I think is very important. And I'm not a developer, but I understand that that's also what it's like, because in my very basic way, I understand, for instance, that the HTML structure, following correct HTML structure, is an important part of accessibility as well as SEO. So if you start from there, I think that you are, don't use tables, don't use divs and spans, and you are already doing things in the right way.
I mean, I think you've pretty much hit the nail on the head, to be colloquial, by saying it's just part of doing a good job. If you're good at your job, then you should be making an accessible website. And if you're not making an accessible website, I don't care how incredibly skilled you are technically, you're not doing a good job, because that's what's necessary for this to be a good product.
Yeah, let's not go into the creative websites. They are very, very
creative.
Very creative. Let's just say that. But I want to say, people, that one very important thing is that Joe has a really great course on LinkedIn Learning that we can maybe get there, which is kind of specific to WordPress, but it talks about accessibility in general as well, and it's a great course to check out, because it's not a super long course, so it's not daunting in any way, and it will give you a much better understanding, and I think it will get you to understanding first and foremost why you should start from accessibility. And as you were saying earlier, it should actually be baked into your process. You shouldn't even mention it the way we don't say, oh, I'm going to build your responsive website, because obviously you're going to build a responsive website. So yeah,
I like to pair it with security. Like we don't say that our default is we build you an insecure website, but if you really, really ask, we'll consider making it secure.
That's
really?
a great one.
That's not something people do. People would
Joe,
get
really
sued so badly for that.
I really appreciate that. And actually, I do have a question, but you mentioned the magical word sue. I'd love to just very quickly jump onto one of Peach's, the earlier question from Peacher. It sounded to me like it's almost impossible for maybe at least in the USA, for somebody to sue based on not being able to access the website, because even the courts can't necessarily say what is deemed to be an accessible website. How do people, i.e. press charges or pursue damages in that way? Do they have to look at other cases as a precedent, or is that kind of messy at the moment?
It is very messy. People can absolutely sue, because under the Americans with Disabilities Act, it is required that places of business be accessible. So a lot of what's going on in the courts is the determination of whether or not websites qualify as a place of business and whether they're an essential place of business. And I'm not a lawyer, so I may be inaccurate in some respects on this,
Sure.
but there are tons of lawsuits surrounding that. And so much of it comes down to judge interpretation. Application of precedent is definitely a big part of the process. And it does have a lot to do with the fact that there are no definite regulations. So you cannot point to a specific characteristic and say, this failing means you do not meet the guidelines. You have to kind of say, is there a problem here? And you know, there are some interesting complications to that, because, for example, in law, more or less, they have to break it down to just accessibility barriers, where actually the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines don't only assess barriers, they also support some degrees of usability. A barrier is going to be something like the purchase button that I need to use to finalize my purchase is a div, and I cannot operate it from the keyboard, so I can't actually buy anything from you. That is a total barrier. A usability issue might be more that I'm not prepared for an example here. Maybe
the example you gave
go.
was very good, though, because I'd have to do a JavaScript on click, which I don't think I can.
Exactly.
I could use a screen reader to do it on click.
I mean,
on that though, sorry, carry on.
There's also, I mean, it's very complicated. There's lots of ways you can make a button, make a div operate as if it's a button. It's just a ton of code. And what's the point when you can just use a button?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And you can style it with CSS.
Right.
On that though, my kind of wrap-up question from me at least is on testing. I mean, we've just mentioned there that I might, as a developer, think this is going to look really pretty. I'm going to make it a div, and it will serve as the submit button, so that when somebody clicks on that, it's then going to do Ajax, whatever I decide it's going to do. Are there any tools that you would recommend to do some form of automated testing, or would you even recommend automated testing?
I do recommend automated testing, and there are a number of tools that can work for that. One of the big caveats for most commercial automated testing tools is that they depend on a rendered version of your site. So like, it's very difficult to actually test the code, because you don't really necessarily know what the code is going to do. So, you look at something like Axe Core from DQ or Tenon.io. Those are both great automated tools. For kind of more semi-automated tools, WebAIM has a toolbar called Wave, which can help you evaluate. It's much more broader. It's got a very rich user interface for kind of looking at all of the kinds of issues that it detects and suggestions and a lot of information. Now, one of the useful things about some platforms for coding is you can actually create linting tools so that you can have some acceptance tests around whether or not this button you've created is actually a button. If you're looking at something like React modules, you can absolutely set up rules that say if you're using this module, it has to have these characteristics. And if it doesn't have those characteristics, we're going to kick it back and say, no, this isn't valid. So you can create code-based tests for accessibility, but mostly those have to be kind of self-driven because they're going to be so much based on all of your other surrounding code rather than being something that's coming from out of the box that's looking at your code and saying, what is this?
So I guess you're saying they are very useful, but don't fully rely if you can also then have real human testing and create some relevant scenarios. So what are the outcomes you want for the website? Can that outcome be achieved? Just like you suggested with regards to accessing a theatre. If I have a wheelchair, I can sure access your website and purchase the ticket, but if there is no way of accessing the building, that's the actual output you want, isn't it? Me to enter the building. Yeah.
You kind of have to look at things in an end-to-end manner of everywhere from arriving to the website to actually using the product and see whether all of that works. And it's a good point you mentioned that the human testing, because that is actually crucial. There is no automated tool that's going to catch all of the potential problems. There's so many things that are simply not testable. They can't be done automated. Something like checking the alt text of an image, which seems superficially simple. Like, yes, you can absolutely check whether or not this image has an alt text, but can you check whether it has an appropriate alt text? That's a lot more complicated.
Exactly. Yeah. Whether it has a meaning that makes sense or not. And this is such an important point. Thank you for making it, Joe, because it goes back for me as a designer to the concept of human-centered design that we too often forget that it's actually people at the other end using our products and websites. So let's not forget about that. And as such, incredibly complex realities that we can't, that an automated tool can't possibly represent correctly and address in all their many manifestations.
Exactly.
Yeah. So I think that you have made so many incredibly useful points, Joe. I'm going to try and go over them one by one now. First of all, we started with accessibility and our business in the sense of, as web developers and designers, what does it mean for us? What are the legal obligations as well as the opportunities for growth? And there are lots of both, basically, and we need to be aware of both. Then we moved on talking about your specialist subject, which is accessibility relative to WordPress, whether the core and the interfaces and the plugins. And again, we talked about how some plugins are accessible, but still there's more that can be done, and you know that because you are a plugin developer as well as everything else. Then we moved on to talk about accessibility improvements specifically in WordPress 5.8, which drops on the 20th of July. Yeah, that's the date, isn't it?
That's correct.
Yes. And you mentioned the improvements to the media library. Infinite scroll is gone. Thank you for that. Substituted by load more. Then we talked about the concept of accessible content, which is relative to captions in your videos, all text done correctly, but also text written in an understandable way, and text that's relative to accessibility of your actual premises, for instance, which was such a great example that you gave us. And then we talked about the the thorny question of accessibility overlays. And even though there are bits of accessibility overlays that can be okay, in general, start with accessibility and you won't need an overlay. It's I think, the core message here. And finally, we talked about testing. Automated testing, again, up to a point is okay, but then we need good old human testing. And isn't it good to know that we still are worth something, that we still are useful, that we can't be completely...
Somebody needs to build those automated tools as well. So
yeah,
I tell you
what, GitHub has this tool for automating the writing of the code. So we're rapidly becoming obsolete.
Yeah, I tell you what. I went to the Web Summit in Lisbon, the huge web conference in 2017, I think it was, and the big surprise was that the opening keynote was actually Stephen Hawkins. And he was not him in real life, but it was a video that was broadcast, and I think it wasn't live. But anyway, it was so thrilling. And all he did is he talked about AI all the time. He basically said, "We are doomed. They're gonna eat us alive. We are finished. The human race is finished." It's kind of what he said. We were like, "Really? Are you sure?" It was really quite impressive, but not yet. I think he's probably right, but not yet. Luckily, we still have some users.
We've got some time left.
Yeah, some time. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, everyone who has tuned in. Please do let us know what has been your biggest takeaway. I will share mine because I actually wrote it down halfway through. Accessibility should be a part of the web developers standard, just like we were joking earlier as well with regards to maybe I'll build you a secure website. These are all standard professional services that we should offer. It's clear we should have a responsive and secure and accessible website. If you want to find out some more information about Joe and everything that Joe does, you can check him out on joedolson.com. You've got some links to your content, and you've got lots of blog posts on there, Joe, where you share some fantastic content. Is there any one thing you would encourage people to go check out today?
Honestly, I haven't looked at my own website this week. I'm not totally sure what the latest thing up there is. It's been a while.
Click on the accessibility link. I would encourage
that. Sounds great.
Also,
do that.
And then, click on the accessibility link. Sign up for his email list. That's on the right-hand side. And check out his socials on there and his GitHub account. I'd also, as well, recommend you go ahead and look at the WordPress plugins that you've made available. There's a whole page of them, including some that you still support and some that are no longer supported. So you can tell I've been having a good look at your website in the background whilst we've all
That's
been
good.
chatting.
At least one of us knows what's on it.
Folks, speaking of websites, here is another one you should be checking out. It's Cloudways /EN/agency. It's the agency partnership program. If you want to be a part of our community, you can join in and get some awesome perks. So if you are an agency, you're hosting many websites for your clients, you've got spends of various sizes, then it might be worth you being a part of the agency partnership program. There's no charge to be a part of that. You get access to some amazing benefits. You get access to an amazing community. So can I encourage you to go ahead, check that out, cloudways.com/EN/Cloudways. Do remember, folks, whatever your takeaways are, let us know in the comments. Please also connect with Joe on social and thank him for the wonderful value that he has given to us today. Before we go,
I love that
video bomb.
So good.
Cat video. Finally.
Before we go, we would like to introduce you to the cat, whose name is
Emma.
Emma.
Hey,
Emma's butt. I love it.
Yep.
Does Emma have an Instagram?
Emma does not have an Instagram, at least not that I'm aware of. I mean, she's a highly technical cat. She might have, done that secretly.
Or she has a GitHub.
Bless.
Anyway, before we go, we will do a very quick round robin of how you can connect with us all, and then we will say goodbye. Shall we start with you, Jan? What's the best way of connecting with you?
The best way to get a hold of me is at virtualsummitmastery.com.
Peacher, best way to connect with you?
On LinkedIn, Picha Neri. If you know how to spell my name, you'll find me.
Awesome. Joe, where's the best place to connect, interact with you?
Probably going to be Twitter at twitter.com/Joe Dolson.
Awesome. And folks, you can connect with me
Yep.
at agencytrailblazer.com and with us, the Mavericks, in the Facebook group. That's the Cloudways users group. So all that's left for us to do is to thank you for joining us and wave bye-bye. Cheerio.
Bye.
Cheerio.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
There we go. And then end broadcast.